Hello and welcome to the web series ZeroPM Pieces. In the ZeroPM Pieces, the researchers in the project will tell you about one piece of the ZeroPM puzzle that they're working on. So without further ado, here comes a ZeroPM piece.
Hi, so I'm Ellise Suffill from the Environmental Psychology Group at the University of Vienna, and today I'm going to talk to you about how experts and non-experts differ in their perceptions of issues like PFAS, and also in relation to essentiality for the essential use concept. Now with this audience I don't have to spend much time talking about the risks associated with PFAS, but just given the sheer number of chemicals in this class, it makes a substance by substance approach to risk regulation, risk assessment pretty untenable. So along with a grouping strategy, the essential use concept has been proposed as a way to streamline the decision-making process, wherein a use of PFAS is only deemed essential if it's shown to be necessary for health, safety, or is critical for the functioning of society, and where there are no available technically and economically feasible alternatives. So the essential use concept is potentially a really great way, as I say, to streamline many risk-benefit trade-offs. But the problem, particularly with the second criteria, so alternatives, when we talk to experts, and this is data from experts who were at the ZeroPM prevention workshop last year, they report that the biggest barrier, or most severe barrier to the successful implementation of the EUC is the comparable risk of alternatives, followed by just a lack of data and evidence on good alternatives. So this is a bit of a stumbling block in the EUC process right now. But we think this is where social sciences could help to alleviate some of the stress, particularly in the case of consumer uses of PFAS. So classically, the EUC is a technical definition of whether PFAS is needed in a certain use in order for us to achieve a certain level of function. If we say we don't need that function, then great, we can regulate that use as non-essential and phase the use out. If it is deemed an essential function, then we have to look to alternatives. And as I say, at the moment, alternatives are a sticking point. So for many uses, there don't seem to be good alternatives. But particularly in the consumer domain, if we look to other cases where consumer data has basically the social standpoint has shifted towards some kind of use, for example in plastics and microplastics, going out there and collecting social data has given us evidence for further cases of what we're calling social substitution. So there may not be, for example, a good alternative at a technical level, but when people are adequately informed about the risks of a certain issue, so microplastics and also here PFAS, then they're willing to accept different kind of levels, different kinds of substitution. So for example, Joel Tickner gives the example of bisphenol in thermally printed receipts. Instead of trying to drop in a different kind of chemical, what we can do instead is provide e-receipts. So we can change the way that the function is provided, and that's something that people are willing to accept. So actually going out there and getting social data on what people need, what level of function they need, what they're willing to accept when they're properly informed of the risks, this is something that can be used to convince industry why it's important to start trying phasing out as many uses of PFAS as possible in the consumer domain at least. And it also gives us the chance to show policymakers where their constituents support or oppose different kinds of policies relating to PFAS. So you might be saying, okay, well, why do we care about non-expert perceptions? They're not experts on the matter. But what the European Environmental Agency's late lessons from early warnings reports show us is just many cases where a failure to engage with stakeholders properly, or to even begin that discussion with different kinds of stakeholders, including the public, has led to suboptimal outcomes. So take the case of antimicrobials being used as growth promoters in livestock. This is something where the risk associated with uncertainty was massively downplayed after the Swan report. It meant that this risk wasn't adequately communicated both to the consumers and also to downstream users like farmers. Now, farmers aren't antimicrobial resistance experts, but they're going to be using, for example, antimicrobials if they're not properly aware of the risks. And indeed, what happened is many people continued to do this process, and now we have increased levels of antimicrobial resistance in animals and humans. Now, there are so many cases of this kind of failure to engage with stakeholders leading to suboptimal outcomes that the EEA states that risk regulators need to avoid expert groupthink and hubris by, among other things, ensuring the use of lay and local knowledge, as well as, of course, the expertise, and to take into full account the assumptions and values of different social groups. So what this might have looked like in relation to the antimicrobial resistance example, if we'd actually adequately informed other people further down the line, including consumers and farmers, of the risk, more consumers would have rejected this as a kind of acceptable end product, and more farmers could have opted out of actually engaging in the practice of using antimicrobials as growth promoters. So we would have had kind of less severe issues of resistance, and also it would have given those farmers the chance to build trust with their consumers and gain an advantage that way. And I should also say that in terms of comparing experts and non-experts, it's not always that, non-expert perceptions aren't valuable. In some cases, the public, who are obviously considered non-expert in certain fields, can be more accurate at predicting key outcomes. So take the case of COVID-19, getting people to take their vaccine was incredibly important. And there was a 680,000 person mega study by Milkman et al. That looked at how effective different kinds of messaging, so text reminders telling people to go and pick up their vaccine from Walmart, how effective were these different kinds of strategies. For example, they'd maybe say slightly different things, or they'd send them at different rates, several days a week, things like this. And they had both the public and the experts who designed these interventions, these kind of text message reminders, to predict what kind of intervention would work best. And even though the scientists involved, the experts involved were the ones that designed these interventions, the non-experts were better at predicting which of the methods would increase vaccine uptake more so than the experts. So actually, we have a lot to learn here, particularly if we're trying to predict, for example, public behavior. We need to go and talk to non-experts like the public. So this was why it's so important, just some of the reasons why it's so important to engage with different stakeholders, even if you don't consider them to be experts in a particular matter. And here I'm just going to outline the sort of three-step process that we take, at least, in order to bridge that gap between experts and non-experts. So the first step is always to describe what different groups know, think, and why. So even when we talk about the public, they're not homogenous. We can think about kind of different subgroups that hold very different opinions on the same matter. You can think about climate change for this example. And then we need to tailor communications towards those people on the basis of their knowledge and beliefs. As you can imagine, kind of pro-environmental messaging might work well for some people and not others on the basis of whether they believe there's something we can do about climate change, whether they believe climate change is real, etc., etc. So this is just a good example of how communications can work well for one group and another, and that's something we can kind of plan for. And yeah, again, anticipating potential opposition and planning interventions. If we think back to the case of COVID, all of the scientific evidence said go and get vaccinated, and yet we had large swathes of society refusing to do so. If there is time to kind of go and talk to a sample of the public and find out why certain people are responding to a message in a negative way, we can try and work around this. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the methods we use to try and achieve these goals. So first up is these wide-scale surveys. So the first step is to go and build an evidence base of what people know, don't know, what they think, what they're worried about. And wide-scale surveys allow us to target a lot of people. So we can get, for example, you should aim for around 1,000 people per country across several countries, or even different regions of the EU, because people tend to differ in their beliefs across these different regions. And we can look at how widely different views are held across different countries and different parts of the EU. And we can also start to look for these areas of social consensus. For example, perhaps there are cases where people agree the benefits outweigh the risks, for example, in the case of PFAS use. And we can also look at the kind of aspects that people agree on in terms of essentiality. Now, this is a planned survey, so I can't show you data from this yet. We're actually just translating it into the relevant countries' languages, but it's just to show you kind of an example of what kinds of things we do in these quantitative surveys. So, for example, we all know that the 2023 restriction proposal for PFAS was submitted by 5 countries in February last year. And the public consultation on this closed in September last year. But do we really have a good kind of representative insight into what the public think on the matter? For example, who are the people who are actually responding to this public consultation? Do they really represent the EU more widely? And also, given that this restriction proposal is generally intended for expert consumption, can your average person really grasp what's going on in that report and then, give their opinion on it? So what we wanted to do is to take key aspects of this restriction proposal, make them as accessible as possible to a range of people, as well as giving them obviously information about PFAS and its risks and benefits. And in return, we get from them insight on different kind of issues related to PFAS more generally and the restriction proposals, potential kind of strategies that it could take. So first off, one of the conversations higher up is, okay, industry says that PFAS is needed for its high performance in industrial applications, but maybe we don't need it in consumer products, so we should just ban it outright in consumer uses. And perhaps this is something that the EU public agrees with, which would be good to feed back to industry in that case. If they say that it should be allowed in some consumer uses, which ones and why? In terms of how quickly should PFAS be banned, or if at all, within the EU, this relates to the different sundown periods proposed within the restriction proposal. Who should pay for PFAS pollution and cleanup? So this relates to the idea of extended user responsibility. And lastly, which is very important for industry again, is what kind of alternatives are people willing to accept? Be this a reduced performance, change in the way that the function is provided, perhaps even some increased costs and differences in availability. So we can feed this information back, particularly to industry, to show them what consumers are willing to accept over PFAS once they're adequately informed of PFAS risks and benefits. Now, because I can't show you data from this survey yet, because we're just currently getting ready to run it, I thought I would give you a kind of snippet of the kind of data we can get through quantitative work. So what we did here is we had a bunch of everyday items that the majority of them can be found to contain PFAS within the EU, so not all of them, but they can, the majority of them, contain PFAS. And we had experts and non-experts rate these items for a range of measures, such as how essential is the function that the item presents, how acceptable is it for PFAS to be in these items. After, of course, we gave people a bit of information about PFAS again, because the majority of the public don't really know anything about PFAS. And what we see is when we compare the experts and the non-experts, what we can do is we can cluster the items together on the way that people are responding to them. So things that kind of receive a similar response pattern end up being clustered together. And what we see in the experts is no clear patterns. So what we think is happening here is basically these experts were from within ZeroPM. So in general, they're of the stance that it's not acceptable for PFAS to be in these products, which is fine. But what that means is all the responses are at floor. So we don't really see any significant differences between items. Now, when we go to the non-experts, this is where it gets really interesting. We actually see two clear clusters forming that make a lot of psychological sense. So at the top, we've got these items that in general tend to be in less direct contact with the body, like ski wax, mobile phones. Okay, you hold it, but you're not ingesting it, for example. Fridges, rainproof jackets, car shampoo, fire extinguishers. And in the bottom, we have items which have more direct contact with the body, such as eye drops, dental hygiene products, makeup, period products, FFP2 masks for COVID. And really interesting towards the bottom is nappies and plastic toys. So the items with less direct contact with the body are rated as being more acceptable to contain PFAS. The items with more direct contact with the body are less acceptable to contain PFAS. And with the nappies and the plastic toys, what's interesting is this is a psychological mechanism that we see in experts as well as non-experts. But whenever there is something that involves a vulnerable group like children, the risk is inflated. So because nappies and plastic toys are used by children generally, this makes the risk of PFAS even more so. Next, I'm going to talk about qualitative surveys. So on the other side, we have these wide-scale surveys that give us lots of data points, thousands of data points per country across lots of people. But really, the information that we have there is whether the majority of people are clicking yes or no, high concern, low concern, should be allowed PFAS in it, shouldn't be allowed to have PFAS in it. We don't have a lot of information about why people are clicking a certain way. So what we do alongside the wide-scale surveys is we look at the similar issues, but with a much smaller group of people. We sit down with them and we do these in-depth interviews where they have the chance to explain to us why they respond a certain way, why they're more worried about PFAS being here than there, for example. So we've completed our qualitative interviews within ZeroPM, and I thought it would be interesting to just pull out some key themes from these interviews. So first of all, of course, let's start with essentiality. And here we asked people which everyday products are essential and why. Now, naturally, the first thing the experts say is, well, we're not talking about the essentiality of the products, we're talking about the essentiality of PFAS in the products, for example. Now, of course, this is true, but when you sit down to talk to the public, as I've said, the majority of the public actually don't know anything about PFAS. So we can't kind of broach this topic immediately talking about, do you think PFAS should be allowed in this item? How essential is PFAS in this item? Instead, what we have to say is, which of these products are most essential to you, okay? And what is it about those products? What function do those products serve that make them so essential to your life? And from there, we have to extrapolate, okay, is that function being served by PFAS or not? I should also say that the European Commission's report on the essential use concept from last year reported that the majority of stakeholders found it inadequate to try and completely separate chemical function and product function when assessing essentiality. And so I think that just validates the approach a little bit here. And what we find in general is that non-experts have a kind of wider definition of essentiality. It's not just health, safety, and functioning of society at the strictest level. Non-essential products that have perhaps been labelled that way at a higher level, for example, I've heard a discussion in terms of PFAS in cosmetics. Well, makeup's not essential in the first place, so we don't even need to discuss whether PFAS is essential in makeup. But that's not what the EUC is. Again, of course, the EUC at a technical level is whether PFAS is essential in a product, whether it's safe in a product. And it's not our job to say which products are essential to people or not. Indeed, we see that makeup, which is a really great example, comes up as being essential to quite a lot of people. So it's not just for everyday wear. Some people report it as being important for their jobs, for example, actors and actresses. And it's also aspects of mental health, so self-esteem, well-being. But I should point out that this does not make PFAS essential in makeup. Actually, when you talk to people and you say, okay, well, you use this product every day, it's really important to you. Now you know a bit about PFAS. How do you feel about if PFAS was in your makeup? They have a big negative response. They say, well, I don't want PFAS in these products. So actually, these products are essential, but that doesn't mean they want PFAS in them. It's usually the other way around. Something that they use every day with the potential for dermal uptake, they don't want something like PFAS in there once they're adequately informed of the risks in a way that they understand. And again, we can look to the microplastics example here. So microbeads in face washes, at some point, they were considered the best performance for washing your face. And again, having a good, clear complexion is part of people's self-esteem. It's very important to them. But when people started to realize that microbeads were basically just microplastics that they were washing down the sink every day, the tide started to turn. Industry saw that consumers were moving away from this, and they voluntarily phased out microbeads in the majority of face washes, and they use alternatives, for example, like ground up apricot shells. So again, it's about informing consumers enough so that they can basically show support for not wanting these kinds of potentially risky chemicals in products that they consider essential. Next, we asked, where do you think chemicals like PFAS are found? And again, the majority of people don't really know anything about PFAS. So they actually analogize, is it like microplastics, which is interesting in itself. And that's because, public knowledge of microplastics is much higher, even though the risks between microplastics and human health are less established than in the case of PFAS. So what we see with PFAS is that people can't perform an adequate risk analysis, and this increases the trust in regulation or the reliance upon regulatory bodies to protect them. So what we see in the transcripts is a whole lot of hoping. So people say, PFAS in period products, I hope not. And also, I don't think it would be allowed. So they say that they think regulation wouldn't have allowed PFAS to be in those products in the first place, even if it has been allowed. For example, yes, we know that PFAS has been found in period products in the EU. And again, we see this for items that involve vulnerable groups. So again, children's toys, they put those toys in their mouth, so I really don't think PFAS would be allowed in there. Lastly, we ask people, how does PFAS get into our bodies? So, we have this item, there's PFAS in it, how does it end up in our bodies? And what we see is that non-experts tend to fixate on a direct exposure route during the use phase. So to some extent, they think about the disposal phase at the end of life, but they less so than the use phase, and they really don't think as much about the production phase as the potential for pollution, unless they're talking about accidental spills, but this is the minority of cases. So actually, they'll think, for example, I have a recycled plastic bottle that has PFAS in it. I keep washing that bottle. The plastic degrades. The PFAS enters the water. I drink the water. The PFAS is in my body. Or I'm using a non-stick pan. It gets scratched. the PFAS goes into my food and then I eat the PFAS, for example. They don't really tend to think of the fact that, well, as long as that pan is being produced, there will be some emissions, and at the end of life, there will be, leaching into the environment. So going forward, in terms of communication, we really need to think about better informing people that it's not just about not using items that contain PFAS, it's also about if PFAS continues to be produced, there will also be landfill and you will receive exposure through indirect routes. So that's something we need to think about going forward. But it does help explain that quantitative data where we see that people are more worried about items that in general have more direct contact with the body. So lastly, I'm going to talk a bit about how we start to think about designing and testing different kinds of labels relating to PFAS. So right now, we might have a consumer out there, maybe she's looking for a pan, maybe she's looking for some cleaning fluids and stuff. And there's two kinds of labels that she might experience. So for example, on the right, we've got these toxin-free pans. This one actually claims to be PFAS and PFOA free. Whether there are micro amounts in there due to contamination, we don't know, but they're allowed to claim to be PFAS free, for example. And on the other side, we have this more GHS CLP style warning label. Now we know PMT for PBT substances, for example, will have to carry some kind of warning under CLP moving forwards. But what do these different labels do to consumer intention and consumer behavior? So we looked at this briefly. I'll only talk about it briefly, but what we found is when people see these PFAS-free labels, it only actively changes their consumer behavior. For example, when they want to pay more for a PFAS-free product versus a product with no label, they only want to pay more for it when they're actually informed about PFAS. So prior to being given information about PFAS, they don't know what this label means, so it doesn't change their consumer behavior. On the other side, with this GHS style warning label, we see a consistent effect, regardless of whether we've given people information about PFAS or not. They want to pay less. They want to avoid products that have this kind of warning label. So what this tells us is that these kind of hazard symbols are so ingrained in at least the EU's public knowledge that they see it and they know it means something negative and they want to avoid it. Now, moving on to this next study that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail, we thought, okay, so on the one hand, we've got something which claims to contain no PFAS, and on the other side, this kind of diamond warning label that says, I contain PFAS. What about something like regulatorily enforced that tells you about the amount, the sort of dosage of PFAS in the product? So we decided to look at, for example, rainproof jackets, which can be treated with fluorinated substances to make them waterproof. And we thought, what about a traffic light system? So this is something that can tell you about, the amount of PFAS, and it's also a system of rating that people are exposed to. So, for example, the Nutri-Score system for food, and also the energy efficiency rating for electronic appliances. So it's something a bit like the hazard label that people are already experienced with, and they can quite quickly gauge what A means versus AE means. So we also wanted to introduce different kinds of framing. So what you can see on the right-hand side is we've got this eco score, human health score, and then a combination of the two. And this framing basically said that if PFAS becomes a pollutant from this jacket and enters the environment, it could have it could cause damage to the environment, that's the eco score, or it could cause damage to human health, so human health score. And naturally, the last one is a combination of the two, so it could damage both the environment and human health. And we had people basically rate a bunch of jackets at baseline. So we just asked them, how willing are you to buy this jacket from a 1 to 7 Likert scale? And here there's no information about PFAS. They're just told they need a rainproof jacket because they're going on holiday to Scotland, somewhere rainy, for example. And of course, we controlled for additional factors like how attractive they found each item and also brand recognition, etc. Then we introduced information about PFAS, and we introduced one of the three framings, so eco, human health, or a combination of the two. And then we had them rate the jackets again, but this time they were manipulated to have one of the scores, so from A to E. Here we're just looking at the extremes, so A to E, to see what effect is produced. And in terms of results, I should say this is very hot off the press, so it's preliminary data. So they could be subject to change as we advance with the analysis. But the first thing is that we don't see any effect of framing. So regardless of whether the outcomes, the potential outcomes, are framed around damage to the environment, human health, or both, there are no differences in people's consumer behavior or consumer intentions. And now this is really interesting from an environmental psychology group because we tend to talk about at least two extremes in society. So in the kind of one side, we've got more left-leaning, biospheric valued people who are motivated to protect the environment. And on the other side, we've got more hedonic valued people who aren't motivated to protect the environment, but might do stuff to protect, for example, human health. And we see no effect of this here. What we see instead is a really consistent effect of the rating system. So going from control to A, people will pay significantly more for an A-rated jacket. And going from control to E, we see a big decrease in what people are willing to pay. So actually, this is quite a consistent system, regardless of, for example, people's differing views on whether we should do stuff to protect the environment, human health, or both. So if we want a consistent system that works well, this might be something to follow up on. And naturally, we want to look at this a little bit more and with different items, for example, not just rainproof jackets. So I'm going to wrap up now, and in terms of what is essential, I think that EUC is potentially a great tool to streamline lots of sort of risk-benefit trade-off decisions, not just in the chemical domain, but it is value-driven. And because of that, it's important that we include diverse voices when we are deciding what's valuable to society or not. And in particular, it's not our job to say which items are, for example, essential to everyday life. It's our job to make those items safe for people to use, for example, the case of makeup. In terms of why it's important to engage with the public, as well as other stakeholder groups on such issues as PFAS and the EUC, well, I hope I've convinced you a little bit today, but if not, I really recommend reading the late lessons from Early Warnings report by the EEA. And I also think there's a positive side to it, so it can help us elucidate further non-essential use cases through social substitution. And last but not least, it gives us the option to provide evidence to policymakers about what their constituents want doing in relation to PFAS pollution. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, you can email me at ellisesuffill@unive.act.at. Thanks.
ZeroPM. Zero pollution of persistent and mobile substances. This project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under grant agreement number 101036756.